Good evening. I'm Chris Wiley with Ulm Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight for a presentation from Minnesota author Christopher Schmitz. Tonight, Christopher will discuss his books and writing science fiction and fantasy. He is the author of The Wolf of the Tesseract and the Caicos Realm series. When he's not writing or working with teenagers, he might be found at comic conventions as a panelist or guest. He has been featured on cable access television broadcasts and metro area podcasts, and he runs a blog for indie authors. Copies of Christopher's books will be available for sale and signing after his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Schmitz.
All right, so we were discussing a little bit before this, and thank you guys for showing up. We're discussing a little bit about me. I do words and stuff. That's really all writing is. I guess some people do it better than others, and some people do it more than others, and that's writing in a nutshell. But I'll talk a little bit about my passion, kind of why I write and all of that. But I grew up in Ferndale, Minnesota, which is the middle of nowhere. If you recognize the cartoon graphic, that's literally the middle of nowhere from Courage the Cowardly Dog. I mentioned earlier I did do a lot of comic conventions where people come, they dressed up all the time, and there's a large lady and a really skinny guy that were, obviously an older married couple. It's always fun to see people that are maybe there with the grandkids or just have always had a love for, for fiction and cartoons and just the medium. And they showed up dressed like Eustace and Eustace's wife. I forget her name, but the lady from the TV show. And they just live in the middle of nowhere, and really bad things happen all the time. And there's nowhere to go and nothing to do, so it makes for a great show. It's a great setup. But I grew up in Ferndale, population, that's the sign, population 575. That's up probably more than 100 people since when I grew up there. But it's kind of a remote wasteland of Minnesota. There's not much to do there, like as a kid. I grew up as a kid in the 80s, and that's really when I developed a deep love for fiction and books, and really stories in general, because it's not just books. But in the 80s, it was difficult to get to locate and find a lot of the science fiction and a lot of the fantasy stuff that I was really into. So I also enjoyed reading comic books. I was in probably third grade. I started writing a comic book, and just stupid, really bad little comic books, like 6, 8, 10 pages long, written on the back of turned-in assignments, and staple them together, and all the kids would read them. It was a story about a guy who's just a normal guy. He was a janitor at a toxic waste manufacturing company. This is 9-year-old me or whatever. The stories didn't have to make sense, and most of them really did not. It was maybe more a reflection of me than anything else. So I'm writing these comics, and then I realize, as I'm kind of growing up between third and fourth grade, I'm like, I got a big problem. This character's married, and I've never showed his wife. I showed him and his son, and I'm kind of drawing this, and I introduced his wife, and then immediately killed her because I'm like, I don't want my mom to read this. I drew a girl with boobs. She's going to ask me all kinds of weird questions, and so sometimes you got to get over those personal hang-ups when you're writing stories, and that was my first real roadblock to writing. But I grew up in the 80s. That's not working. That's all right. So I grew up in the 80s. And the cartoons in that era had a lot of great themes that I really loved, and really kind of molded and shaped me. I loved some of the genre blending things. Like in the 80s, we didn't really ask questions when they had like high technology and magic all in the same world, like Thundercats, Masters of the Universe. They would just take like these crazy things, and you've got like, you might have like the Star Wars blaster in one hand, and you got a sword, and somebody casting magic kind of all at the same time, which was really cool. So there's a lot of great stories that came out in that era that really influenced me. Like Aliens came out. Actually, Aliens came out I think the year I was born. Predator came out. We had the Terminator. And one of the themes in those that have really have really latched onto me and I've really used, in addition to sci-fi and just kind of terrifying stories, is constant action, suspense, and danger. I've had people that have told me they've read my books, they're like, man, I needed a break. Like it was a page turner, yes, but like I physically couldn't put it down because as soon as something happened, like something else started happening. Like I felt like I was like out of breath reading the whole time. Like, awesome, that's exactly what I wanted you to feel. So I run with some of those themes of redemption often in my books as well. And I borrow different themes from my own faith. My background is actually in religious work. So I work with kids in a couple of different programs. Some of them are faith-based. One of them is not. And sometimes I insert those themes subtly, and then sometimes I don't. Like my Keiko's realm is pretty overt if you've gotten that far, and some of it's and actually I took that advice from a bestseller who told me, he's like, when you're writing with themes of good and evil, and if you're going to include any kind of faith-based component, either be overt or be very subtle. And most of my books are very subtle. Some of them are definitely not. So I've been writing about this theme, this idea of unsafe worlds, really since I was in high school. I did start writing about then. Was in a lot of English classes, writing short stories, and I remember one student was like, "Oh man, I got to write 3 pages. And Chris is gonna write like 40 pages and just like start a novel over there." And I remember thinking, "Yeah, maybe I'll do that." Ooh, it's working. It's just not broadcasting. It's on the HDMI. I think you need to be on the PC because it's a PC cable coming out. There we go. We'll edit all this out, right? That's the one. Yeah, so basically I live Stranger Things. At least I feel watching Stranger Things. If you've not seen Stranger Things, you need to get with the program. That's my favorite all-time TV show, especially season 1. Season 2 is pretty good too, but it just like made me get all of the feels, which was pretty cool. But so when I was a kid, I remember this very distinctly in the middle of nowhere. Passed like this tax bill in town, like everybody's gonna get cable now, like it's all gonna be hooked up. If you want it, you'll be able to get it. New technology, yay! And my house is the last house on the edge of town at city limits. Like there's a big field between my house and like all of the other houses in town. And I'm like, yeah, we're gonna get cable, it's gonna be great. And they're like, well, not you guys. I mean, we said all the houses in town, you get to pay the tax, but we're not actually gonna run, it costs too much money to run the lines even though you paid for it. So I'm like, ah! And of course, it was a Jacob Wetterling era, so you really couldn't, like, and I lived right on Highway 10, and, you know, parents are freaking out, like, you can't go anywhere! But I had, like, 10 acres of woods behind my house. So I tell you, my imagination kind of got to run wild when I wasn't reading or renting laser discs down at the video store. But unsafe worlds. So yeah, Terminator, Aliens, Predator. I'm convinced that whoever filmed the movie Doom stole my first book. The first book they ever really wrote, it was a really long short story. And it was a story of these people who went to the moon, and really it's like it was the gateway to hell, and all these monsters were pouring out, and these guys had to stop it, which is basically the theme of Doom. And I'm pretty sure they found that old pencil-written script that I had and turned it into a movie, and you know what? They can have it. It was awful. So I joke about that, but I don't want credit if that's an actual fact. But I remember really catching on to fiction. I was in 2nd grade, and I was reading this story, and I gained a lot of fiction as well as like apocalyptic stories and sci-fi. And I read, there was these, do you guys remember Weekly Readers? Yeah, Weekly Readers, and they had like an excerpt from this book, and I really loved it, and it like stuck with me for years, and I couldn't remember what it was called, and started asking around, really for years and years, until I could finally locate what this book was called. It was Day of the Triffids. And I'm like, man, it's an apocalyptic book with alien plants that try and take over the world. I'm like, cool. And this is before eBay, this is before the internet, and this started a 16-year search for me to find this book. Maybe it wasn't 6. I think it was 12 years. It was because my age, it would have been a 12-year search, and I found it. I think I was a senior in high school, and I found it in a used book bin for $0.25. And so this was my story of chasing this book until I could finally find it. Before internet shopping was not a thing. There was no place to get it. I lived in the middle of nowhere, so there was no access for me even to find books. And my librarian hated me, so she wasn't about to get it. We didn't have a working conversation. I read at a much higher level than she thought I should, so she'd be like, "You can't check out all those books, you'll never." I'm like, "Watch me," which might be why I read the books that I did. I was in like 4th grade, I was reading Tolkien, and a lot of these big books that for a 4th grader you might go, "Whoa, that's pretty up there." And so maybe she was challenging me secretly, but I guess it worked, if that's what she meant. I didn't feel like that's what she meant, but here I am now, so I guess kudos to both of us. But I do love sci-fi. I do love apocalypse. John Wyndham writes an apocalyptic theme is often in a lot of his different books. He also actually wrote under another pseudonym as well, and I read many of his books, mostly from the golden age of sci-fi, when I was a teenager. Because I could find the other books, but I just could never find this one. So I started reading everything that I could find by John Wyndham. But do you guys want me to do a short reading of a short story? There's a story in here that maybe perfectly captures my love of sci-fi and apocalypse and kind of all these things. You might feel like you can see the robots from the Terminator, and then also catch all the apocalyptic themes in that. So it's a little story I wrote. It's a flash fiction, so it's like 1,000 words, called Love and Fallout. It was published somewhere, I can't remember where. But here it is. Her body heat's gone. Ray jolted awake. Where's Samantha? He scrambled from bed, eyes quickly tuning to the dark. His wife snored below a mishmash network of antiquated lead pipes, interwoven to form a makeshift barrier against the radiation. The enemy paid little attention to the borderlands nearest the nuclear desolation. Humans couldn't survive inside the irradiated wastelands for long. He spread his senses out. Noises of his sleeping 8-year-old son in the next room. Little Samantha wasn't upstairs where she belonged. He needed to find her, though he knew she probably stood in front of the microwave. As soon as Ray's feet touched the cold wood floor, a crash echoed in the main level of the farmhouse they'd commandeered. His arm snatched a sawed-off shotgun he always kept near. He snapped on the utility belt that held his extra shells and a Geiger counter. Heart pounding, Ray crept downstairs. Samantha knew enough not to make noises like that, and death squads never made those sorts of errors. Cyborgs made few mistakes. Creeping through the shadow, Ray spotted 2 mangy human intruders, half-starved and as unkempt as John the Baptist. Ray whistled, and they spun to find a short barrel in each of their faces. "Whoa there, friend," the taller one offered. "I'm Jimmy Boy. This here's Wizard." Ray returned a steely stare. "Wizard? Like from Oz? His name's Osborne." Eyeing the wild-eyed shorter one, Ray demanded, "Get out of my house." "Sorry to intrude," Jimmy nodded as if tipping an imaginary hat. "We had no idea this place was occupied." Wizard glared back at Ray, a deranged glint lit behind his eyes. "We'll be on our way then, Wizard." "Wizard?" Ray's finger twitched against the trigger. "Hello, little one. What's your name?" Wizard asked, suddenly shifting his demeanor, crouching to one knee. Ray's gun followed him the whole way. Ray didn't glance back. "Samantha, get out of here. Go, now." "Oh, wait," Wizard said, words warm and friendly. "You've got popcorn. I love popcorn." Samantha, only 4 years old, clutched an old bag of unpopped kernels. "I can't get the microwave to work, Daddy." "Samantha." "I can't get them to pop." She was still sleepy. She frequently sleepwalked since the first nukes dropped a year ago when the cyborgs seized control. They'd fled their suburban home during family movie night. Their lives had been forever shattered. "Popcorn's my favorite," Wizard continued. "My mom used to say it's not the microwave that makes them pop, it's the love between 2 people. We always shared some when I was little." Something changed in Wizard's eyes, and Ray almost believed him. Then he caught an evil twinkle as a vagrant's hand slipped inside his pocket. "Run!" Ray screamed to his daughter, smashing the deadly barrel into the intruders' faces. He heard her feet scamper away. "Take it easy," Jimmy said as the hazy morning light crept in the window. "We'll be on our way. We mean no harm." Sweat beaded Ray's brow. "Not so fast. Outside, right now." He waggled a gun to express his sincerity. Forcing his hostages to strip shirtless and pantless, Ray barked orders under the red morning sky and hot wind. "Turn those pockets inside out." "Please let us go." Jimmy verged on tears, Wizard's face set like concrete. "Do it," Ray threatened. "So help me, I've seen everyone and everything I love annihilated by those soulless monsters. Don't think I won't pull this trigger. Now empty those pockets." Jimmy quickly complied. He'd brought nothing. Wizard didn't move. "I will shoot you." "No." His cold gray eyes challenged Ray more than words could. "No." Wizard leaned aside and waved to Samantha. "Are you soulless as well? You'd murder me in front of your little girl?" "I think not." Two simultaneous reports exploded, scattering pieces of the intruders' heads across the yard. "Wrong answer, Wizard." Ray lamented over the gun smoke as he crouched to search pockets. "Soulless never, but humanity ain't what it was a year ago." Rummaging through Wizard's pockets, Ray retrieved a flashing electronic beacon. "Oh no," he whispered. Even as a shrill whine of the sky drone filled his ears, his heart sank, his fears confirmed. The trespassers were bloodhounds, human traders employed to sell out their own kind. Ray fled, scooping up his little girl, even as the hazy sky began falling, bleeding acid rain. Hot rivulets burned like salty wounds, concealing Ray's tears as he dashed past a rusty, blackened grain elevator. The airborne drone belched a ground-roving death squad even as it hovered above, firing missiles. Rockets streaked into the house. Flames erupted nearly as high as the aerial. The family's home was disintegrated once again. Ray winced at the explosion. He knew his wife and son lay dead or dying. Samantha screamed in terror, holding her close. Ray sprinted towards the charred woods, hoping the radioactive storm wouldn't push their way. The death squad would find them soon, unless they risked the fallout sector. Flipping his Geiger counter on, Ray pushed into the dead forest, glancing back at the dilapidated farm buildings that suffered various degrees of damage from the caustic winds. The death squad roved far behind, and Ray pushed headlong into the hot zone. Only dark thoughts and his whimpering daughter gave him any reason to live. "I'm not soulless." Ray looked down at Samantha. His heart threatened to burst with pain and love. Those emotions reassured him that his soul was right. Hope those things have souls too. He wanted to see them burn in eventual hellfire. "The devil take you." The Geiger counter ticked a steady cadence, and then it sped up. It clicked dangerously fast, mirroring Ray's heartbeat. Then it died, trailing off, old batteries failing. Ray slowed and stopped, sinking to his knees. He squeezed Samantha in a tight hug. Then the ticking started again. No, not the Geiger counter. The popcorn began popping inside Samantha's bag. "Look, Daddy." "I know, sweetie." Ray breathed heavily. "Just a few seconds, we can show Mommy." Thank you. So, one of the things I've discovered is that, like, the light of hope shines brightest in the darkness of hopelessness. So I enjoy using high stakes and apocalypse to make that, that light burn even brighter. So obviously that story didn't really have a happy ending, but it was short enough to read all in one sitting. So, but it gives you kind of a feel for my writing and the themes that I prefer to use and to write. But The Day of the Triffids, like I said, it's one of my all-time favorites. All of my kids are readers, and all of them have read this book. So that was something I instilled in them, kind of sharing that story. But I use unconventional heroes. It's one of the other recurring themes that I use. Things like in The Wolf of the Tesseract, I'm stringing together really this world like Masters of the Universe, Eternia from the 1980s cartoon, mixing it up with things like string theory and dimensional travel. One of my favorite writers has always been Madeline L'Engle. So using the Tesseract isn't like this Marvel Cinematic Universe Tesseract. It's that dimensional travel that Madeline L'Engle uses and talks about and explores some similar themes also with He-Man. Not really, but also with werewolves, really. I use a lot of different things like shapeshifters because we don't always really know what things are real, what things are are happening. And very often, I mean, you don't have to be very old before you've discovered that people are liars and that the reality that you're shown is very often false. And of course, we all like to perpetuate that, because if you've ever had a young niece or nephew, you've probably told them something that wasn't true because it's funny. So it's just one of the like natural things about the world. My favorite one is I convinced my nephew, who is probably 6 or 7, because we're going fishing. I'm like, we gotta go dig a hole and get some worms. I dug a little hole. I'm like, you have to sing because they're attracted to songs. He believed this for years. It was awesome. He might still believe it. And I think he's in junior high now. I'm just secretly hoping that, you know, somewhere he's going to say something about that. Sometime everybody's going to turn and look at him and go, what did you say? And no one can take that away from me. Anyway, so these are some of my characters up there in this comic book that I had for The Wolf of the Tesseract. Book 2 is coming out. I'm doing a huge book signing with some other fiction authors from Minnesota, including a New York Times best-selling fantasy author, Stephen Brust, if you guys are familiar with him, who I met doing on the convention circuit, speaking at panels. And that's when that will come out, and that's June, so a couple of months, and that one will be out. But here's some of the slides from my comic book. And yeah, these guys were incredibly talented, but I wanted to use this to bridge the gap, because I think, well, books are stories, obviously, but when I go in and I've gone in and talked to kids in elementary schools and libraries, and a lot of times I just talk about stories themselves. And I usually talk about that in the context of, you know, don't be the villain in somebody else's stories, because there's always a bad guy somewhere. Treat your friends kindly, treat your peers kindly, because somebody is the villain in somebody else's story, and we should be nice enough so it's not you. But people relate to stories, so not just books and comic books, but also television, also movies, also video games. I mean, there are so many ways that we consume stories. And with comic books, so many people are drawn to them at these conventions that I go to, so I commissioned this comic book to be kind of that bridge. Because a lot of people I talk to are like, oh yeah, I don't really read at all. I mean, I read comic books. So I'm like, hey, you know what? Let me inspire you with the story, and then you can come over and get this book, because I like to inspire literacy. My kids read. They read at a high level, and I think that that's really the cornerstone and foundation for success as an adult. If you didn't read much up into your adult years and you don't develop a passion for that, I really think that you're a couple of steps behind somebody that is a voracious reader. But yeah, these guys were just phenomenal. And that's Wolf of the Tesseract. But I've got several as of yet unpublished books. Just today, I finished my Robin Hood versus Vampires. It's a series of 5 books that I'm trying to write all in one sitting. I discovered that I can write a ton if I put my mind to it after doing NaNoWriMo. So I inspired myself kind of to this project. And Wolf of the Tesseract, the sequel is coming out, so I'm constantly writing and doing stuff. I don't think I can stop. I think I might need to see somebody. But that's just my wife talking. She's like, why do you stay up and write all the time? I'm like, I can't stop. But anyway, that book is called The Hidden Rings of Mrid and the Cambion. And basically, Robin Hood becomes a paranormal investigator funded by the Catholic Church, and kind of runs this underground group of detectives, of people that kind of fight against all of the arcane things happening. And then there's a larger plot arc. And he's actually transported at the beginning of the story about 200 years in the future, so there's time travel too. It's really it's a really fun story. And that's actually a YA book, but I don't think people will care. I think they'll just be so thrilled that it's Robin Hood and vampires. I mean, what's not to love? But they're actually pretty similar to my Decker's Dozen series, which is futuristic. It's kind of Western space opera, Firefly-esque. I just say Firefly, and people snatch it up at comic conventions, which is great. So at Comic Cons, this is one of my best 2 selling books. Just because all I have to say is, it's like Firefly, give it to me. So, but the dozen, or the leader, Decker, of this group of 12 mercenaries that really they're just trying to keep gas in the ship, and you try and do the right thing whenever they really can. He's secretly like a part of this group that kind of really has roots all the way back to the Knights Templar. And there's 2 novellas and a novel in this series. And after I finish my Hidden Ring series, I'm going to sit down and write I'm going to turn the 2 novellas, because they go sequentially. I'm going to write 2 more, and then turn that into another book, and then write a whole other novel-length adventure after that. And then the Keiko's Realm series, the 3rd one, is out now. And it's got some of the scariest characters that I've written in the 3rd book. That the characters that are big and bad in book 1 and 2, they just kind of cross paths, and they just kind of do one of these. And as I wrote it, I'm like, I almost get goosebumps just writing the description on this guy. He's not really good or bad. He's just powerful, and not in a good way, because he doesn't really have good intentions, at least not for the good guys. But yeah, my first novel I had mentioned, Doom, it's very similar to that. They can have that, but I have a lot of fun networking authors at Stephen Brust over there on the left, and then he writes the what's the name of that? He writes a series about. Well, he's Romanian by background, so the name is kind of hard to pronounce, but he writes a pretty interesting series that's pretty well known. He's from Minnesota, so he's at a lot of Minnesota cons. He actually lives in the Minneapolis area. And on the right is Joey Lee. I met him quite by accident. I was discussing my love of all things 80s with my daughter at a Barnes & Noble. And I'm like, oh man, I didn't even know they were making a book about that. And I reached down and I picked up a YA novel. It's a Dark Crystal prequel. I'm like, sweet, I think I'm going to have to get this. And I hear a voice behind me go, did you say Dark Crystal? And this older lady kind of pops around. She goes, my son wrote that book. I'm like, what? Sweet. And so she put me in touch with him. We did a blog interview, and we did an event. It was at a Comic-Con that we were at. Obviously, I dress up because that gets people to look, and then I can talk about books with them. And that's a lot of fun. But I get to meet a lot of interesting and awesome people, and I really think that everybody has a story. It's just a matter of sitting down and putting it on paper. And I get to encourage a lot of young authors who ask me questions, and I send them to my blog. I'm like, just email me if you need more, if you need input. If you just need somebody to say you can do it, just email me. I'll tell you that, because I believe that. And so I have a lot of fun with talking to kids, which I said is my day job anyway. I enjoy everything kind of about kids. Just you have a youthful optimism in outlook on life, and I think that's awesome. But yeah, so I have some books available. I have stuff available that I'm writing all the time. I have several books that are unpublished still on my hard drive, and I'm constantly going back and refining them. And some of them that are not published, the only reason is because they're currently in the hands of literary agents and publishers, and I'm shopping them around, trying to find somebody that says, yeah, I like it, I'm going to put this out. But I also do a lot of other fun stuff. That's my family. We live in Redwood Falls. It's us taking a big selfie. That's my daughter, the author, going to a Comic-Con with me. And then I get to travel around. I play the bagpipes. I'm the annoying loud guy in town. So that's a lot of fun. That's one of the other things that gets me around town. But any questions?
You mentioned National Novel Writing Month, and have you published or written something just in that November time frame that's come out? I asked that because we promoted it last year, and I'd love to pull that book specifically to show people.
Yes, I wrote a book, a very tongue-in-cheek comedy about two police detectives. One, this big bad, he's kind of stoic, like nothing really amuses him, and his partner, they're close, and they're like the A team on this police detective squad. I've never really written crime fiction, and I guess I really didn't, because the one detective gets killed right away in kind of the intro, and there's this other character that gets paired. He's this bumbling idiot, messes everything up, doesn't know if he should even be a cop anymore. He'd be just passed the detective's exam, and he winds up getting paired up with this other guy because he learned, because he's a huge nerd, goes to comic conventions and all these different things, and he learned that by looking at how it was all killed, he's like, that's exactly how they killed the hero's sidekick in whatever issue variant edition of this, and he kind of rattles all this off, and they're like, the chief is like, well, meet your new partner, I guess. He knows something that none of us are really on board with, so they wind up then discovering there's a greater plot to kill Will Wheaton, the guy who played. Everybody, I mean, if you're a nerd, you know Will Wheaton. He was Wesley Crusher on on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and he's at this comic convention. But then you find out he's actually just like the one detective, the nerd guy, quits and leaves because turns out that he's got this mysterious love interest that's going to be there, but he stood her up like at a con. Like his phone died and he got lost in the hotel because he's really just kind of this big just messes everything up. And couldn't find her, and so he just got really embarrassed and left. And so he's been like avoiding her for a year now. Now he's got to face her with that, and it's got a lot of just fun hijinks. It's got like this crazy setup, like a portal to Relaya opens in the men's room. You've got this like back alley war between the furries and the bronies. You've got all these weird, just random things happening at conventions that really kind of plays up the humor aspect of that. But if you've ever been to a con, you can read some of this and go, that only stretches to the imagination a little bit. But that was a real fun book to write. I was able to write some of my friends in there using their names as some of the characters because they were asking me to do it, and it was a good time. It is not out. I pitched that I gave an elevator 15-second pitch to a literary agent. They're like, send me a full copy of that. I want to read it. So that's kind of fun. That might come out in the future. If it gets sold, if not, maybe I'll do something with it because I can sell it at Comic Cons. But yeah, NaNoWriMo was fun. And I wrote a new version of my Decker's Dozen. I wrote about a 20,000 word novella. Just to kind of play with Scrivener. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Scrivener. It's a piece of writing software, and if you're writing NaNoWriMo, I would highly suggest it. It has some built-in tools that really, really help you keep writing. Like it will have a counter if you want to set it to write so many words a day, so you can complete your NaNoWriMo number. It will show you like on a progress bar as you're writing. It will slowly fill up, and you're not done writing until it's done. And it's got little things like a blackout mode, so we'll stop like pop-ups and things like that. So you're not going to see your Facebook telling you you've got alerts and all these sorts of things. So it's a good piece. It's like $60. It's been worth every penny, at least to me. Other questions?
I have many, so I'm going to go
All
again.
right.
Tell me about the current authors you're reading and recommending.
I read a lot of indie authors, and I realize sometimes that I do that because I do a lot of reviews and stuff on my blog, and I do it to try and help promote other authors and build their confidence and build relationships. And I've realized over the last year or two that I should read some other stuff that really is really good because some indie stuff is just not very good. A lot of stuff I read, I'm like, probably needed one more draft on that. And that's, as an artist, I mean, any artist could say, like you might be doing a painting and be like, I mean, I could do this. But at some point, you just release it and into the wild and decide it's done. Some independent authors don't have a voice doing quality control, and so sometimes I know that I don't want to water down what I'm at and begin to have that mindset. So I've tried to add some other voices. Some of the stuff that I'm reading now, Tolkien always. I think next up on my reading list is Beren and Luthien. And I picked everything new that they're releasing. I just pick up on impulse and will read it. Song of Kalervo was another one that I read when that came out. And it's dark. I remember setting it down when I finished it. I'm like, I think Tolkien actually invented grimdark. Holy cow. It's not a big surprise that this was not published. And so it was released by the Tolkien family because they know his name will sell books. And this was something that he wrote and we can make money on. But that was definitely not finished. But it's interesting to see all of the actual professors of Tolkien studies that wrote articles about Tolkien and his process in writing and really about why this was never published. So the whole thing is really more of a study on Tolkien and his writing than it is about the actual story of the Song of Kalervo. I read another book by David Oppegard recently, he's a Minnesota author. Flux, I think, has published most of the stuff that he's written, called The Firebug of Ballard County. I read one of the books that I've recommended. It's an indie book that I just loved. It's an apocalyptic alien invasion story called, I've recommended it a few times from blogs and radio shows. I might not remember off the tip of my head, tip of my tongue. I don't know. I need more coffee, I guess. But I've got some pretty good recommendations if I sat down and kind of scrolled through my blog on things that I've read. But a lot of the classics like that are some of the things that I do love. It's the last great thing that I really read. I can picture it too, but I just can't see the title. But I try and read at least a book a week, which is, so that's why it's kind of cool to go to, if you remember video stores, you go to the video store and you spend 3 hours staring at the shelves and go home without a video. We don't have time to watch a movie anymore. We saw all the choices and that was it. So sometimes it's just being overwhelmed with that by how many of those. So, next question. I know you have more, so. You have a question?
I was going to ask, is there any other subgenres or that you haven't really, because it seems like you played with a lot of different genres.
So
is there
many
any subgenres that you haven't done yet that you're looking to maybe go into?
I don't really play with romance. My idea of a perfect romantic angle in a book, and I have some romance lines in them. There's a pretty strong one in the Wolves of the Tesseract series between the main character and then Claire Jones, this college student from Duluth who's being chased by a sorcerer. But I don't really do like romance unless I make it weird. But my ideal like this NaNoWriMo book that I did, there's this weird love quadrangle, and that's actually what sold it. The person that said, give that to me, I want to read the whole thing, is actually a literary agent who represents primarily romance stories. I pitched him it's a weird romance. Happens at a Comic-Con. There's people in fursuits. She's like, enough said, I want it. It sounds great. But Han Solo and Leia in The Empire Strikes Back. You got a kiss in the back. Somebody interrupts. Oh, yeah, okay. And it's like the tension that's there, but never really fulfilled and achieved. I think it was kind of a letdown when Han and Leia finally kissed in Return of the Jedi. It's like, come on, man. Ross and Rachel this thing out for 6 seasons. Let's do it. But yes, I don't do much with romance. I'm not really looking to get into it. I would like to, because I write, my sci-fi is more space opera, but I would love to write some hard sci-fi. It's in my blood. I've read so much of it. I love it. I recommend books like Mark Cooper and Jay Allen. Some classics like Heinlein just floats my boat. So it's there. It's I want to do it, but I've got pages of story notes. And I'm I want to write these stories too, though. But someday I will break into some hard sci-fi, I think. And my problem is I tend to tie a lot of my stories with Easter eggs from one into the other all the time. I'll have to be a clean break because I can't Easter egg to my space opera for my hard sci-fi just by nature of the world that I've established in the space opera. Because there's not much for military to speak of. There's not a strong presence, which is it's all kind of part of that world that I developed.
When do you decide that it might be useful to kill off a character? I'm thinking of Kelsa in this.
Yes.
book here. I was reading along in Rajnir,
Yes.
and Kelsa were in love, and they were going to get married, and then she dies.
My mother read the rough draft of that, and she just she had it somehow. I probably gave it to her, and I'm in the middle of like a work meeting, and I get a phone call. My mother chews me out. She's like, "How dare you kill that character?" Sometimes I have characters that I intentionally kill. I try and really heighten a lot of the tension and the stakes by letting people, the readers, know that nobody's really safe. I was doing some Tolkien stuff, not Tolkien, Martin stuff before I ever knew that Game of Thrones was a thing. I kind of hype it when I go to Comic Cons. I'm like, Keiko's Realm, it's like a non-pervy Game of Thrones with elves and other stuff in it too. So that helps us sell. And then some people hand it back like, but I wanted the pervy stuff. It's like, well, if you do, just use your imagination and take the book. I'm like, I'm sure you can just insert them into weird, awkward situations. We're at a Comic-Con. It won't be hard. But some of them, it just happens when you're writing. Sometimes the story kind of takes over. Like I was mentioning with this earlier, this character that I wrote with Down syndrome. In the Wolves of the Tesseract series, has my favorite supporting character of all time. It's this gal who's, I wonder if I get a picture on any of those slides. It'd be this gal. There's like she's just like this sidekick. This gal right over there to Claire Jones. And she's like their best friends from high school, and they're in college now, and she's going to get married, and they really have this alliance against this other girl who's the sister of the groom to be, and they're like, well, she's only she's not my best friend. You're my best friend. She's just this. She's chubby and proud. She's like, I love Krispy Kremes like beyond anything else in the world, and it's just bubbly and vivacious, and she almost steals the story because I wrote Claire as sort of an everyman character. So she's very kind of flat by comparison until she comes into her own later in the story. So whenever they're together, sometimes it's almost like, and we all have a friend like that, where the friend almost just steals the show and will talk over you, but you're fine with it because you know that they know what I want. They're gonna, in the end, we're all gonna be happy. So she's in the story sometimes, and then sometimes she's not, based on when they're traveling and kind of fleeing away from enemies and things like that. So sometimes I have to be careful to take those characters out. But yeah, sometimes I do that by killing them.
So do you feel like the story's in your head, and all you got to do is write it down?
Absolutely.
I'm getting that from you.
The Keiko's Realm is 7 books. It's just only 3 of them are written right now. So I know where they're all going. I know how the whole series ends. I know exactly in the scene what happens in the very last epic battle scene and how it all goes. And I know exactly how I'm going to write it too. I just have to write it. The problem is they're long stories. They're 130,000 words a piece, and I've got 4 of them to write. But I've got 4 other books that I'm currently writing to get there, and I got a bunch of short stories that I want to write. I'm overwhelmed sometimes by my own plans, and I have no one to blame but myself and libraries that had good books.
You do YA and you do adult books. Have you thought about younger?
So the Hidden Rings of Mrydin the Cambion. Mrydin the Cambion is a name. It's a more archaic version of Merlin, and some of the Arthurian legend has so many different tellings and retellings, and the same with Robin Hood. So you never really know which was the original storyline. But one of them has that all of Merlin's power came from the fact that he was a Cambion, which is would be fathered by a demon, but mother is a human. So that's where his power comes from. And I'm using kind of that name and that storyline as a tangent for where does Merlin come from. He's not in the first book at all. there are many stories of how Merlin dies, and one of them is that he's trapped in a tower by Nimue, or I mean, there's many names she goes by, and who was his apprentice. And she trapped him up there, left him there until he just eventually died of old age. So in this story, Merlin has these magic rings, and he sent them out so that these heroes will find them, and he knows when, kind of, and how, just by prognostication or whatever. And we found out actually he's done this a whole bunch of times in a time loop, just until he eventually succeeds, so that they all go through a test, which is kind of a book in each, until all these heroes wind up coming back, releasing Merlin, having to fight this great evil that has even ensnared Arthur. And that's the last book. But that book, while it's YA, it's younger YA, upper middle grade. So that's kind of, so I'm trying to get that direction. So the book itself is only about 50,000 words. It'll be, for sure, it'll be under 60,000, so it's not going to be intimidating, overwhelming to some of them younger readers that might want to jump into that. But I do find YA is hard to write. In writing YA fiction, it's not just dumb your characters down, sex it up, make a love triangle. I mean, those are some things that are common in YA, but really it's not about those things. It's about your point of view. It's your character, based on your mental development, should be within a certain age range, because that reflects the next step where your readers are kind of going. In that age range, when you start talking about like mental development, like our brains don't really develop until we're 24 to 26. So we're in that stage when we are young adults, when we are that 15 to 22, we are extremely narcissistic. We only see things through our point of view. So, which is maybe why so many YA books are first person, which I just loathe. I hate first person point of view. Like when I do reviews for indie authors, I'm like, if it's first person point of view, do not send it to me. I won't even read them anymore. Mainly because people that are independent authors don't have the quality control, don't do first person very good, because they'll break first person point of view to insert third person point of view things all the time. And you can't do that. That breaks your point of view, and it pulls you out of the story. So I don't do that. I don't care for it that much to begin with, but it's so often not well done that I just loathe it. I don't hesitate to use a strong word for my dislike of it. But trying to circle back to the question. What was the question?
About YA and junior.
Oh, yeah. So I do some of that. Yeah, oh, yeah. The thing with YA, really what it is crafting a character where everything, they kind of think that it is about them, and then you have to make the story kind of be about them. So it's more character-centric. Your characters are, by default, a little more selfish. And maybe not selfish, but at least their perception of the world is that they are the center of it. When they're the main character, that does kind of help a little. But it's harder to use that. And then also, knocking out some of the silver dollar words that, like, people are like, why do you talk like that? I'm like, because I read a lot as a kid. I'm like, I'm sorry that you don't understand all these human words that I think are normal, but you just have never heard before. I'm like, here's a book. It's a dictionary. Or just read it or something. But so I really do talk, like, people have read me, like, I don't understand some of these big words you use. I'm like, I'm sorry. Sometimes in drafts, I do come back after having beta readers kind of go through them. I'm like, I have to take out some of the words and rewrite these because, yeah, not everybody has that high reading level in vocabulary. But in YA especially, being aware that your younger readers, they're not going to have that. And that's not their fault, because they are going to be young readers. So using those more sparingly and giving them context that's really overt to figure those out.
Do you think the technology today, I'm just picturing Buck Rogers, 1960s, the corny type of sci-fi.
He was at a convention I was at recently.
But one thing they did was they landed their spaceship like SpaceX and others are doing now. And it just seems to me like there's more kids now that are probably interested in that kind of stuff than maybe in the last 20 years, because we weren't really doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that helps with maybe getting their interest in? I mean, then I'm thinking of Star Trek, how that kind of got a whole bunch of people interested in stuff.
And a lot of this, I think it's more that it's mainstream now too, and that people kind of know about it, and it's publicized so people can get their interest up.
Do you think they teach enough different genres in schools?
No. Schools.
It seems to me like
I blogged about this. My wife is a teacher, and when they were switching over a lot of their literary curriculum to whoever's in charge now, the people that are responsible for things like Common Core. There are some things that I like about Common Core, some things that I don't. But one of the things I really dislike about it is how they've handled reading. They've just stripped all of the fun and enjoyment out of it. They've, like their reading list, what they have kids reading is almost exclusively nonfiction. And unless you already like the topic that the nonfiction is being written about, you're not going to care as a kid. And so a lot of kids I've discovered in working with youth coming up is they don't have a love of reading because they don't have a love of stories. They're like, oh, reading. Yeah, I don't want to learn about baseball or about the invention of the internal combustion engine. I'm like,
isn't part of that choice to have the choice of what they read rather than you're
Yeah.
going to read this?
well, they had made some decisions that it needs to be nonfiction, and like they decided like the ratios as part of like what you're going to teach, and you have some flexibility within there. But the ratio had to be, it was like 80 or 90% like nonfiction. So you've already sucked the wind out of the desire for those kids to read. And so then when they have to, reading becomes a chore for them. And that's, I think, bad. But I do kind of see some other positivity coming out in with young readers, in that there's something called screen fatigue. So I get a lot of book requests on my blog because I have a bunch of followers on my blog, and I read book requests, and I'm willing to even read an indie author. So that makes me kind of a unicorn in that world. I tell all of those people, I'm like, you need to just send me it's like $3. Print a book through your CreateSpace account and mail it to me. Like, I get screen fatigue. I spend a lot of time because I'm writing and I'm blogging and I'm doing these things. I don't need more time on a device. That's punishment. That's not like all these kids. We put them in front of screens. I'm like, don't do that. Throw them outside and tell them to play in the rain. Tell them to go get lost in the woods. You'll find them in an hour if they're not back. Let them explore and use their imagination, interact with the world. Not that they should, we should get rid of those things entirely, but screen fatigue is real. For the first year, I did a blog that's coming out. It won't come out to probably July, but based on last year's stats, that paperbacks are now on the rise, whereas ebooks were just rising, and then they kind of leveled, and now they're starting to decline. Because people realize, I don't want to be on another device after working 8 hours a day sitting in front of a computer. They really want to escape. And even if you're on the e-reader, if you're not on a dedicated Kindle where all you get is your story, then it's popping up. Because I do it all the time. When I read ebooks, I read them on a Kindle, and I don't have a Kindle, but my kids have that. So I use the Kindle app on a tablet, and I'm reading, and it pops up, bling. Facebook hasn't seen you in a while. Bling, somebody, it's constantly going off because those apps are designed to force you to engage, or they annoy you into it. Books are where it's at. Paperbacks, I love paperbacks. And there's nothing like the smell of paperbacks and coffee. I mean, come on. But so I think that's really speaks well of where we're headed as far as readers. I think there's a return to having the physical thing in your hand. Which I think is going to help overall, because I think kids do get screen fatigue. And if we want to inspire them to read and to read more, we got to give them the tools to succeed. And currently we're not, because we're not encouraging.
How old are your children?
16 and 14.
I got a 17-year-old.
Okay.
But I made a mistake when they were little, as getting them into technology big time. And now as a parent that did that, I think to myself, you really shouldn't be doing any technology until about the 3rd grade. Let them have their childhood and discover other things. There'll be plenty of time.
My son is a big-time introvert, and he does read some, but not much. So whenever I see a book somewhere on his possession, I kind of smile, and I know I think I'm secretly winning. But he spends a lot of time on his computer. Whereas my daughter, if she's on her computer, she's probably writing. She's completed her first novel, and I actually took her to this big literary convention and introduced her to agents. Let her take some adult level classes and courses where she's learning about editing and revisions. So she's really taking all of these to heart. She took way more notes than I did, and she's just like everything they were saying. She's just like, this is good. I gotta use this. I know how to use that advice in my next draft, and so it's kind of neat to see those things. And it was weird because my son was a reader before my daughter was, and at least at an earlier age. But I mean, I think some people are maybe wired more towards like being fascinated by the tech gadgets and things like that. And my daughter was like, yeah, whatever. I don't really care.
So do you ever put your family into your stories in some kind of, or friends, or
Yes.
people that you know? Like
You're going to meet every time I read. There's a character in that book that you have there. His little boy. His name is Gibbon. When I wrote it, he was about the same age as my son. Gibbon's life is not a good life, and there's a scene not in this book, but in the next book. So Gibbon survives at least one book, where something happens. And every time I read it, I can't help but get really emotional when it happens. So because in my mind, it's like that's my 4 or 5 year old son, and I don't model any of them right after a character, but they're very often aspects of my family, of my friends that wind up in books. And like they say to authors, like authors say, don't tick me off. I'll write you into my book and then kill you. It's so cathartic.
But it's pretty harmless. I mean, you're not just doing it
Yes,
in fiction. Or you're not,
that's true. I would never follow through with a.
I think that's a great place to end.
Thank you guys for having me. That was more applause than I deserved.